We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Lindsay Smith. I will be your host. A little bit about me. I am field editor with Real Agriculture, a national agriculture media company based out of Lethbridge, Alberta. I myself, however, are based just west of Ottawa, and I am also a solar grazer, a sheep producer. So I have a great interest in today's topic as well. Before I bring everyone in, I just want to say a few things about how today is going to go. So thank you for joining us for the School of Public Policy's Simpson Center for Agriculture and Food Innovation and Public Education, Measuring Food's Environmental Impacts, a Starting Point. There's some really interesting research we're going to dig into today. So I'm super excited and can't wait to hear from both our guests. Just so you know how today will work, we will hear from both of our speakers today. We will then have a moderated discussion following those two presentations. And then we will have an open question and answer period. So at any time, please enter your questions in that Q&A box down there on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We'll try to get through as many of them as we can. Please be specific. And if your question is for one guest in particular, please let me know. We'll get to those at the end of today's program. All right, without further ado, I'll introduce our two panelists. Joshua Bourassa, he's a research associate with the Simpson Center for Agriculture and Food Innovation and Public Education at the School of Public Policy, and Thomas Nemecek, a deputy leader, the Life Cycle Assessment Group, Agroscope. So Thomas and Joshua is going to present first. And today's panelists are going to explore Alberta's agriculture production, specifically some grain and some livestock production, and the accompanying greenhouse gas emissions, and put this in a global context. So I'm pretty excited about today. All right, Joshua, if you would like to take the floor, I'll hand it over to you, and then we'll move to Thomas's presentation after that.
All right, good morning. My name is Josh Bourassa. I'm a research associate here at the Simpson Center. Today, my presentation will cover what we kind of described at the center as the starting place for the carbon program. And with this, we will start looking at just general trends in Canadian emissions, as well as some methodologies used for these estimates. Now, before jumping directly into these the ag emissions, I have found it useful to try to place these emissions within the full Canadian economy context, as well as look at some of the political considerations they may be influencing some of Canada's targets. So to start off, the Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed in 2015, really can be viewed as the driving force behind a lot of Canada's emission plans or environmental measures. So starting with the Pan-Canadian Framework, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, the Strengthened Climate Plan, and again, to some extent, the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which was recently received royal assent. Canada's national, or all of these different measures have had the same focus of looking to reduce emissions to achieve Canada's nationally determined contributions. So looking at Canada's first NDC, which was submitted in 2016, we are looking at a 30% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030. This has been updated earlier this month to be between 40 to 45% in terms of reduction from the 2005 levels. So how has Canada done so far? And really, simply put, not great. Emissions have decreased, but only by about 9 megatons of CO2 equivalent. And to meet that first emissions commitment, the 2016 NDC, it will have to fall to about 511 megatons, so quite a bit to go. Now, agriculture is a relatively small portion. It's seen as that yellow section of the graph, and it's going to be around 8 to 10% depending on the measures used. This measure has also remained relatively constant regardless of the classification or the methodology since 2005. And although ag does not make up a large share of total emissions, as we do approach 2025, when the next NDC is supposed to be submitted for its update, if these emissions are not going down, or they are starting to continue to increase, there may be more pressure to reduce these agricultural emissions, which is going to be a challenge. So within the carbon program, one of our main objectives is to come up or to help develop policy recommendations to help Canada, especially within Alberta, reduce emissions to help contribute to these nationally determined contribution commitments, while trying to maintain production levels, or looking at trying to maintain these production levels, or if emissions or production levels do have to decrease, trying to minimize disruption to the industry. Now, as mentioned, emissions have remained relatively the same across the Canadian agricultural sector. We're looking at an increase of only about 1 megaton of CO2 from 72 to 73 from 2005 to 2019. However, there has been quite a bit of change in the underlying sectors. So looking at animal production, specifically, these emissions have fallen from 44 megatons of CO2 in 2005 to 36 in 2019. Crop production, on the other hand, has been gradually growing as far back as the 1990s, but we do see this rather large growth from 2005 onwards, which has offset the losses from animal production, which has kind of made it the same. On-farm fuel use has really not changed much, although there is some fluctuation. Overall, it hasn't really contributed to the increase or helped decrease the total amount of emissions. So to understand to understand what is driving these changes in emissions, we really want to look at the methodology specifically. So we are using the National Inventory Reports data, which is submitted annually. And with that, they do have a very transparent and well-publicized methodology. So it was quite easy for us to start taking looks at how these measures are, how they come up with these measures. So for agricultural emissions, the general methodology is the emissions are going to be equal to an activity data multiplied by an emission factor, with the activity data being maybe head of cattle, and the emission factor for that being kilograms of methane emitted per head. Now, these estimates are also done at a fairly granular level. For crop production specifically, they do look at the eco-district level for the 405 eco-districts that have agricultural production taking place in them. And these measurements are a much wider system of equations that looks at the emissions at each level and how they are connected. So changes to, say, the weight of cattle will have an effect on its enteric fermentation, the emissions from manure management, and then again, indirectly, the amount of inorganic nitrogen applied onto fields. Now, crop production is going to be the main focus of this, at least for this presentation. And when we're looking at it, it is comprised of several components. So the first one being agricultural soils. We also have field burning and liming urea application, other carbon-containing fertilizer application. Agricultural soils, however, is going to be that largest component at about 19 megatons of CO2 equivalent. When going into the specifics of the estimates for that agricultural soil emission. The activity data is going to be an estimated nitrogen fertilizer use, and that is going to be dependent really on the crops being grown in each eco-district. And that measurement is going to be based off a recommended nitrogen fertilizer application rate. The emission factors are what we're going to be looking at is a ratio of precipitation over potential evaporation. And this is, you're going to see some very large differences between provinces, which is going to result in very large differences in total emissions, or when you're looking at emission intensities. Topography plays a little bit of a lesser role. It does influence where water is going to pool, or the ground is going to be have more moisture in it, which is going to result in higher overall emissions. And then with different land management practices, either affecting the availability of nitrogen in the soil or increasing the amount of moisture within the soil. And those could be things like irrigation, reduced tillage, or planting cover crops. So taking a look at agricultural soil emissions, this is both direct and indirect N2O emissions. What we do see is that Alberta and Saskatchewan do have the highest rates of emissions, and these emissions have grown considerably since 2000. However, this really isn't unexpected, as Alberta, you're looking at about 25 million acres of crops or land used for crop production, whereas in Saskatchewan, you're looking at about 40 compared to Ontario at around 9. The more interesting comparison is going to be between Manitoba and Ontario, as they both have similar land masses, but differences in the crop mix, in moisture content in the soil, and in management practices are going to be resulting in significantly different emission levels. Looking at the emission intensities, what we have here is what you can see is that once you start looking at emissions per acre, Western Canada does emit at a significantly lower level than in the East, with Ontario being one of the lower eastern emit provinces on a per acre basis. This is really going to reflect some of the crop mix, but really looking at the differences in soil moisture. So when comparing between Ontario and the Western provinces, the emission factors are going to be between 2 and 8 times higher in Ontario. And that is really going to be based off that P over PE ratio. When looking between the Western provinces, Manitoba does have a higher percentage of gray and black soils, which is going to have a higher P over PE ratio associated with it, and is going to have that higher level of emissions. But the differences between Alberta and Saskatchewan, it took us a while when we started looking at the different aspects of it and the different management practices and crop mixes. And one of the things that we've come to think is that this is going to be really related to the amount of irrigation within Alberta when compared to Saskatchewan, as Alberta does have the majority of Canada's total irrigated land. And that's going to really drive up that emission, a P over PE ratio and that emission factor, resulting in much higher emissions in those areas under irrigation. Now, for the next steps for the projects for us, we really are going to be looking at trying to reproduce a lot of the estimates in the NIR, specifically around Alberta and some of the other prairie provinces, using current methodologies and the methodologies provided. We want to start using those systems of equations then to start modeling the effects of changing different emission factors, or looking at different characteristics and seeing those overall effects and how it affects each stage of emissions, as well as working with stakeholders to start trying to improve on some of the data and some of the assumptions. As a lot of the initial work was done in the early 2000s, there may be some differences or some assumptions that may not be as accurate today. And lastly, we want to work with stakeholders to develop some pragmatic policy options to help reduce overall emissions. And thank you. I guess I'll hand it back to the moderator.
All right, thank you, Josh. That's fantastic. And we've already got some questions rolling in. So of course, we'll ask those after Thomas's presentation and after we've had a bit of a moderated discussion. But of course, now I will hand the floor over to Thomas for your presentation.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you for the invitation. And yeah, I've shown my screen. So I would like to present results from LCA Studies, and we did a comprehensive meta-analysis of different LCA studies. Was published 3 years ago, and I will present some results from this. So life cycle assessment is similar to what was presented before. So basically we are using the same or similar emission factors, same methodologies, but the focus is a little bit different. It's more on a product. So the system boundaries, what is included in the inventory and the assessment is a bit different. So first, we will have a look on a global situation. So on the global scale, the food sector contributes 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. Another 5% come from non-food agriculture. And if you look on other environmental impacts, this can be much higher, up to 80% for eutrophication. So the food sector is really important. And within this food sector, animal products have a large share. It's more than 50%, can be even higher for land use, less for fresh water. And if you compare that with the contribution to protein and calorie supply, you see that the environmental impacts are quite high. So we analyzed for 40 different products the environmental impacts for greenhouse gas emissions, acidification, eutrophication, land use, and also fresh water use. And we found that within the same product, the variability is very large. The best 10% of producers make it 4 times better than the worst 10%. So there is a large room for improvement. And what we also saw is that animal products, here marked with this red bar, have much higher impact on a protein basis than plant-based alternatives. So this is meat and seafood compared to alternatives, and cow milk compared to soy milk. So by changing the diet, we can reduce environmental impacts a lot. So where does this variability come from? I show here one example from the study. Different beef producers. We have German intensive bull fattening. We have dairy cows in the Netherlands, which are culled at the end of life. And we have extensive beef fattening from Brazil. And we have a factor up of 30 for land use for the same product, basically. And for climate change, a factor of 6. So there is really a huge difference according to the region and the production system. So this explains part of the variability. What we also saw is that it is not only highly variable, but also a skewed distribution. We have analyzed the contribution of the 25% of producers with the highest impact. So this is the 25% line, is the red line. And we saw on average, it's around 50% is caused by just 25% of producers. And if you look at meat and dairy product, this can be even higher, up to 80%. So we have a large share of the impact, which is caused by a relatively small share of the products. And if we can improve this production or reduce the production by changing our consumption and take these producers out of production, we can have a very high reduction of impacts. Let's look at the food supply chain. Where do the impacts come from here for greenhouse gases? So we analyze for different products, and we have impacts from land use change, which are quite important for some products and not important for others. So we have, for example, tofu and soy milk, so soybean production, palm oil and sugarcane, which have a high impact. Other crops have low impacts from land use change. We have, of course, crop production, a major share. This is light green here. Animal production, the emissions coming from the animals. So overall, agriculture is responsible for a large share of the impacts. But we have also transports. These are mainly important for fruit and vegetables and for air freight. Packaging is important for liquids like beer, for example. And storage is also important, where we have cool storage like for fruit and vegetables. Food losses are important for all types of food. So if we reduce food losses and food waste, this is always a good thing. We have analyzed successful producers. Here are some examples for wheat and beef. And all these have below median greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at these patterns, just the colors, you see that they're quite different. So for example, wheat producers in Australia, conventionally, they have large emissions from fertilizers applied, so they can improve that. In Cyprus, the main emissions came from irrigations. And if you take the organic wheat in Germany, it's the emissions from farmyard manure and from grain drying. So it can be quite different, but all these were quite successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to analyze the different production systems and take the appropriate measures. From the meta study, I've extracted the data from Canada for milk, beef, and wheat and rye production and compared to the global data. So what we see here for beef, it's roughly similar. For milk and wheat and rye, the land use is higher in Canada on average compared to average global production. If we look at the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of milk, beef, and wheat, we see lower impacts for milk and similar impacts for beef and wheat and rye. So this is a brief glance on some results from Canada. We don't have results for Alberta. My last two slides. First, some words on measuring environmental impact. So what is important from perspective of life cycle assessment? We should look at multiple indicators. Greenhouse gas emissions are very important, no doubt, but it's not enough to look only on carbon footprint. We also should consider biodiversity, land use, water use, etc., because there are trade-offs between these indicators. We should look at the variability. Josh has already shown that there are big differences also between different regions. This offers opportunities to improve because some producers are doing better than others. And if we can understand this variability, we can take mitigation measures. It is important to consider a full life cycle of a product because you can have burden shifts. You can export burdens from outside your farm or outside the boundaries of the country by importing food, like we have in Switzerland, for example. We are importing almost half of the food. So most of the impacts are occurring outside our country boundaries. And we should relate the environmental impacts to a product unit to improve the efficiency. So now what can be done? Some general observations which we have from different LCA studies. So from crop production, I would say put the right crop at the right place. It means avoiding cultivating peat soils and deforested areas, avoiding areas with endangered species. We should give these areas back to nature to protect these species and protect biodiversity, and avoid growing crops with a high water demand in an arid zone. Yields should not be too low. We do not need to have maximum yields, but they should be moderate to high to be efficient. And we should avoid unnecessarily input like fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation water. So we should give as much as needed, not less, not more. This is quite obvious, but in practice, it's not always the case. For animal production, the choice of the production system is crucial. For example, for beef, it matters if the calves for fattening comes from the dairy system, from dairy cows, or from a beef system without milk production. We should increase feed conversion efficiency. That's really a key to be efficient and have low environmental impact. And we should produce and use feedstuffs with low environmental impacts. And from the food consumption perspective, the meat consumption should be reduced. It is too high currently in many countries from an environmental point of view, but also from a health perspective, and avoid food waste. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, Thomas. Thank you so much. All right, so we are going to have a bit of a moderated discussion now. The comments and the questions are continuing to roll in, and I really appreciate that. So please, as we're having this discussion, please continue to add to that Q&A. We'll get to those in about 10-15 minutes. I'll be honest, I've been taking notes rather furiously, and I have many questions. And so I do want to sort of round out some of this conversation, and certainly some of the questions that have already popped up in the Q&A as well. And there is one that's asking to see your second last slide, Thomas. So I want to refer back to that one as well, because I guess there's some people who want to get another look at that. So we'll get to that in just a moment. I think I want to back up just a little bit, Josh, if I could go to you first. We certainly are, the reason we're having this conversation largely is because, of course, we have national targets, we have goals to reduce our emissions, you know, from a government perspective, regardless of sort of the right thing to do perspective. So are there set emission targets for livestock production sort of written within Canada's commitments specifically?
Not what I've seen so far. Within Canada's first couple climate plans, what you see was a lot of focus on soil carbon sequestration, and a lot of money going towards investment into new technologies. At the provincial level, there is some work on better education, more work on using, sorry, just blanked on that, better testing for making sure we have the right amount of fertilizer going at the right place. But overall, there really hasn't been much in terms of national targets. The only target that has been proposed has been on the crop production side, which is currently in the development stage. It was proposed in the Strength and Climate Plan, which came out in December, or late November, early December, and looked at a 30% reduction in fertilizer-based emissions by, or 2020 levels, but they did not provide a date, although it's kind of implied that it would be 2030 when the rest of the climate plan is really coming up. That number has been factored into a lot of federal estimates of where emissions are going to be, and that those emission reductions are going to be required for Canada to meet its 2030 commitment levels for at least its first nationally determined contribution.
Okay. Now, one of my questions, and this Thomas, this one is for you for sure. One of the suggested sort of paths that we need to be taking, of course, is reducing waste. From a perspective of a livestock producer, livestock, especially ruminants, are actually a key component in using crop byproducts, crop processing byproducts, crop aftermath, and potentially also consuming a lot of what would be considered non-human food. And so how does that play into, assessing the greenhouse gas impact? Who gets the credit for that is, I guess, my question.
Yeah, in LCA, we are looking on multifunctionality of systems. So if a system produces different products, you have to handle that by allocation or system expansion. So this is considered in that share of the burden goes to the side streams. And of course, if we had no animals, that would create also a number of problems, like evaluating byproducts. But currently, the amount of these byproducts and also the use of grassland does not fully justify the high meat consumption we have today.
And when you say
So
high
we
meat
can
consumption,
use the grassland with less animals.
Right. Okay. So when you say high meat consumption, you're referring to sort of European and North American meat consumption, or is that global? Okay. Just to clarify. Okay. And a follow-up question then, when you're looking at different production systems and around the world, I for one am kind of shocked to see how much burning apparently happens in Australia of crop residue. I sort of want to shake my head at that. And I grew up in Manitoba where we used to burn a lot of residue and we don't anymore. So, but definitely sort of kind of surprising there. But in your work, what has been sort of the more important distinction when dealing with greenhouse gas emissions? Is it the production region or the production system?
I think it depends a lot on what we are looking. If it's poultry or pig production, this is largely independent of the location. So it depends on the system and on the feed you are using and how the feed stuff is produced. If you go for crop production, this is much more dependent on soil and climate. And the same also if you have beef or dairy production with grazing. This also depends a lot on the environment and the conditions you have. So there the region plays much higher role. But in general, it is quite difficult to separate these two aspects.
Okay. All right. And Josh, I'll go back to you. Now, one of the questions here in data. So this is one of our big challenges in all of this, right? Is that we need to be able to measure impacts, changes, all of these sorts of things. So you're using NIR reported data in your work. What are some of the other options?
Well, when we first started out looking, the original idea was to kind of do a bit more of a literature review, starting to look at, so the NIR just being one aspect. There's the physical flows accounts from Stat Canada, and there's quite a bit of other smaller reporting from separate studies that have looked at different aspects of those emissions. The big ones, though, being at the federal level, being the NIR, which reports two different measures, one being one following the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change designated sectors. And one of them is specific to Canada, being these Canadian economic sectors, which is the ones that I showed today. for the most part, where they break it down by economic activity and not specific emissions source. The differences are going to come between those and, say, the physical flows accounts from Statistics Canada is the time frame that it's looked at, and also the classification. So a lot of the methodologies are going to be the same when you're looking at like these big national emissions estimates, but how they classify it and the time frame being used is going to differ. So the physical flows accounts is looking a lot more at tying it directly to economic activity. So it's classified by industry. So we can be looking at emissions from specific point, or like say meat slaughtering facilities, and then tie it to GDP data from that. But those are not the official estimates coming out of the federal government. And that's one of the reasons why we chose that, is these are the official estimates. These are what all the targets are based off of. And so let's look at those ones because we want to try to help reduce those numbers to meet those targets.
So, you know, from my perspective, my head spins a little bit with a lot of this, because as a farmer, but also someone who's worked in agriculture media for 20 years, and having followed this and having to cover the policy side, what I'm to wrap my head around, Thomas, is as you brought up some of our solutions, and Josh, you've got these numbers that, you know, so we can measure some of these things. I guess part of the question, maybe Josh, I'll go to you, and then to Thomas, and then we'll move to the open questions. But how much, as we shape policy, right? I mean, this is what we're talking about. How much of the practical on the ground, what's already happening or what is trying to be done, and I'm thinking of the 4R stewardship for crop production, how much of something like that, and then the actual policy of here's our goals, how much conversation is there and connection between these two things of what we're measuring, where we want to get to, but what's actually happening on the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is something that we are really trying to do and really trying to reach out to stakeholders with. So talking with industry and talking with other groups just to get a better idea of what's actually happening. That's why one of our main points that we're looking at for our next steps is looking at the assumptions being made in those estimates. So one of the things that we noticed right off the bat is emissions being measured from irrigated land have an extremely high ratio, which is equal to, like, for every, or precipitation is equal to potential evaporation. And is that an accurate assessment? Or are farmers actually reducing the amount of water being applied, which would result in significantly lower emissions from that area? So it's, I guess, trying to have these conversations with producers, and then using the methodology to identify areas where emissions can be reduced, and then seeing how emission reductions actually if they actually can take place, and if it's realistic for it to occur.
All right, and there's a couple questions coming in that sort of delve into that a little bit further, and we're going to go those in a moment. But Thomas, you know, one of your solutions and part of your discussion on this is, you know, making sure that we're not over applying fertilizer, which absolutely, and this is where things like nutrient stewardship and these sorts of things come in. But you mentioned, you know, essentially cutting back production. Have you ever walked into a group of farmers to suggest that? Because I'd love to know how that goes. And I'm saying it sort of tongue in cheek, but realistically, if we're asking as a nation, as Canada, to say, to meet these targets, here's what we need to do, what policy do you see in place to essentially offset? I mean, these are businesses, farms are businesses, right? And they've got incredible bills to pay. If they're supposed to take a production cut, that's an income cut. How do we as a country, if this is what we value, support those farmers?
I would not say we should reduce the production. You should not produce less. We should produce better, which is not easy. Many research institutes are working on that. So efficient, but not necessarily reducing yields, because exactly if we have too low yields, the system becomes inefficient. You have also inputs, like if you have sowing a field, this is largely independent of the yield finally. So if you have a low yield, the burden of tillage, of sowing, of harvesting will be relatively higher.
Mm-hmm. Right, which brings us to the Q&A portion, and I think it dovetails in very nicely. So I'm going to work through some of these questions. There's some really great ones. We've answered some of them a little bit, but this was the first one. So Karen, this is your question, and I like this because this was one of my questions, Josh, in looking at when you were comparing the provincial emissions, you express it in total acres, but the question is, are you going to try and express the intensities as per unit of product? So when we come to that efficiency discussion, should we be, or can we, to better compare efficiency, should we be basing it on tons of wheat or pounds of beef produced or per unit of production versus for land base per se?
Yeah, that would be I would say that would be a good way of doing it. And that's kind of where we're trying to go right off the bat. The difficulty, I guess, with that is just the availability of data specific for it and trying to get more accurate information. So we do have, we can estimate emissions from, say, wheat based off of its recommended fertilizer application rate per acre, and then look at the overall effect. But I think, it's just going to take more time in the steps. We're still very early in the project. When it comes to beef, again, that is one of our kind of end goals, is looking at per kilo of beef and looking at the changes in per kilo of beef emissions per kilo. But we also have to really take into account too the fact that Canada's emission targets are set in terms of total emissions. And so if we do focus too much on the per kilo or per bushel, we do risk continue to increase emissions or continuing to change or not really focusing on the target, which is to reduce emissions overall. But yes, increasing efficiencies is definitely one way of doing that, and something that we are going to look into.
All right. Now, Thomas, I think this question is probably best answered by you here from Kalpana. What would be the true cost of our food if our environmental impact was included?
There are some people calculating this. We are not using these methodologies, but it's sure that especially meat would have a higher price than it has today if we include environmental cost. And for plant-based products, it will also be higher, but not as much because the impacts, especially of animal products, are undervalued currently in the prices.
So that now it's not in the Q&A, but I'm the moderator, so I'm going to use my moderator hat and follow up on that one. That do we run the risk of potentially being somewhat privileged in recognizing that there is a big portion of the population, even here in our backyard, that struggles to make ends meet? And by focusing, strictly on emissions, do we run the risk of increasing the cost to those who can afford it the least? Because from a personal perspective, when I look at plant alternatives, let's say, they're not typically necessarily geared towards a bargain sort of shopper. And ultimately, we all need to eat. So how do we balance that value of food security for some of our most vulnerable with the goals of environmental sustainability?
So if we speak of these meat replacement products, they are partly quite expensive. So this is big business. There are also opportunities to make money. But there are other products which are maybe a bit forgotten today, but which are not costly. You can cook pulses, for example, and you have good proteins and a lot of valuable nutrient, and that's not very expensive. So I think we have to have a bit more imagination and not only take the convenience food in this supermarket.
All right. Eric has a question, and Josh, I'm going to say this is probably for you, but Thomas, by all means, if you want to hop in on this one. Eric says he's not sure how to ask this, but do we need a 10-time or 100-time reduction in emissions per land use, which would be radical change, or do we need to reduce our emissions by 10 or 20%, which is really more fine tuning?
Yeah. Well, what we're looking at taking like this approach of looking at the methodology, we are looking at that 1 to 2% change in practices and then looking at the effects overall. When you're looking at, say, like nitrogen fertilizer application, depending on where you are and depending on your soil types, like you're getting about 3 kilograms of N2O being emitted for every kilogram of nitrogen you're applying on the field. So if you are finding ways, so improving on nutrient management or adopting some more precision agricultural practices, you may have the opportunity across a whole field to start to significantly reduce emissions on an annual basis. And when you start looking across the province, a 1 kilo reduction in nitrogen applied per acre will have a fairly large overall impact. Also changing some of the crop types too, and looking at, again, growing more things like pulses, which are going to have much lower nitrogen requirements, are going to, again, have very large impacts overall. I don't think anybody's really calling for major changes in the industry. Right now, we're really trying to look at where can we improve slightly so that we can start getting that downward movement in terms of total emissions in the sector.
Right, and so you had that one slide where you showed that the livestock industry had made some gains in reducing their emissions, but the crop sector had crept up, and yet fuel use had essentially stayed sort of constant, which I find sort of fascinating. And so do you attribute that to fertilizer use? Is that the nitrogen fertilizer use that's driving most of that, or do you have the details? Yeah, okay.
From what I've read, and also looking at terms of like overall sale data, with how much nitrogen fertilizer is sold in each province, which is probably the best when we have our shipments into the province. What we see is that there is a very large jump starting in the mid 2000s and continuing onwards. And yeah, that's going to be just with the methodology itself, that is going to contribute to a large portion of that growth in terms of total emissions. The beef sector is also going to be based a lot on head of cattle. There was a very large drop in terms of the national cattle herd in 2005 with BSE. The BSE outbreak, and going down to 2010. And since then, emissions have been relatively constant, and that's in line with the national herd. But there has been a lot of differences in terms of those emission intensities coming from cattle, with cattle getting larger, emitting more, but having less cattle overall, or being able to generate more meat from it, which is going to be beneficial.
And I'm afraid we're about to see another drop in the cow herd here pretty substantially, unfortunately. Now, moving to Rhonda's question here. If meat consumption is decreased, so Thomas, I'll bring this to you. If meat consumption is decreased, what are the impacts of increased plant production to meet the increased demand for plant-based products, which can result in native grasslands being destroyed and losing that valuable ecosystem?
Okay, we made some calculations. So today we are using a large part of the cropland to produce feedstuffs for animals. So if you use that cropland to produce food. We have enough to feed the whole population. And even we would need less cropland than we need today. And I think it's not the point of abandoning animal production completely, but we have to reduce animal production and to use the grassland, to use the byproducts, and to provide some nutrients which are less available in plant-based food, but to go for a more flexitarian diet with less meat, less animal products, and that would be beneficial for the environment and also for our health.
Right, and one of your, as you mentioned, the mitigation opportunities for sure is, you know, as you said, the right crop in the right place. So that's going to match with growing conditions. So one of my points there would be, realistically, the Canadian prairies are prairie, which is perennial cover and grassland. So, you know, what would be the impact of actually putting in a concerted effort to convert large areas back to grassland? Because when you look at and if you do that, you need ruminants to make that a healthy ecosystem. So should that be a goal? Would that help Canada meet its emissions targets if we moved cropland back into grassland?
I'm not sure that this is the solution, because we will need the cropland, the good cropland, to produce food for human nutrition. So I think we should produce crops there for food, and use the grasslands for animals, for grazing, and maintain a certain production. But this is not what we have today, so it would be probably much lower.
Okay, we've got a few last questions here. We have a few moments left. So anyone, please, if you do have a question that you want to ask that you feel we haven't covered yet, please, by all means, we have just a few moments if you can enter it in that Q&A box. We'll get to these last ones here before we have to sign off. So question for Josh, this is from Karen. Would we use LCA analysis for Alberta crops or products, or farm to gate? Why would we use one versus the other?
Yeah, right now we're really focused on just emissions coming from the farm itself, or from agricultural activities taking place on the farm. We are going to be expanding into looking at land use and the effects of changing land use on total emissions, which is something that we haven't really had the time to go into. The reason why we're mainly focusing on this, like on-farm emissions, instead of looking at the full life cycle, is we are, again, focusing most of our work on trying to meet those emission targets, and trying to decrease agriculture's share of that total, or agriculture's contribution to total emissions, where when we're looking at transportation of food products, that is going to fall under a different area with completely different regulations being applied to it and different policies being put forward. If we're looking at refrigeration, there is different aspects that it's just going to be too much to cover, I guess, by taking the full look. So we are going to focus again on specifically the ag-based emissions, because that is one thing that we could really dive into and try to reduce it at that point. And as you saw with some of Thomas's slide, like that nitrogen application in wheat is going to be one of those very high emitting areas, which would have a large effect on the overall emissions if you are going to use like a life cycle analysis.
Okay. All right.
If I may add,
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
And the comment, I think for the national greenhouse gas inventories, you want to have the total emissions from a country, and you want to reduce it, and monitor the reduction. life cycle assessment has a different goal. So you have a product and you want everything what is related with this one product. So the boundaries we draw are different because on a national level, it does not necessarily matter if the emission is in one sector or the other, if the total is there. But for life cycle assessment, we have different perspectives. So it's not one should replace the other. It's a different goal and a different methodology, which is adequate for the goal.
Okay, and so I think this, as we approach here our hour, which this has gone by very quickly, at least for me, I don't know about the two of you, but a final question here, Thomas, I'll pose to you. Karen says you've worked on this for a number of years. Where have some of your recommendations been put into policy to date? So is there a country or jurisdiction that has actually implemented some changes based on your research and is using your research?
Well, concretely for this study, which I presented here, I don't know. It has been in many media and discussed widely. But our research at Agroscope, we are belonging to the Swiss Federal Office of Agriculture. We are consulting the Federal Office of Agriculture, and our research is used. For example, if a new subsidies are introduced or changed, they test if they have positive or negative effects on the environment. So in this sense, it is used from different studies. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Josh, any final comments before I wrap up here?
Nope. Just thank you for today.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you both. Thank you to Thomas. Thank you to Josh for sharing your research. Thank you for giving of your time today and answering everyone's questions. I really do appreciate it. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining us and for posing these questions to our two experts. For everyone who has attended today, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link because this was recorded. So this will be available after the fact. And information about upcoming webinars from the Simpson Center for Agriculture and Food Innovation and Public Education can always be found at policyschool.ca. So thank you both for your time today. Thank you to the audience. And thank you to everyone. My name is Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture. And this has been fantastic. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.